All right, so let's talk about floor monitors or wedges. And those two terms kind of go interchangeably. Now, what I mean by that is literally a speaker on the floor, or it could be propped up on a stand potentially. And it's aimed at the musician. It could also be shared by multiple musicians, and it's pumping out a mix directly to them that's designed to let them hear what they need to hear. Now, what are the pros and cons to this? Well, the pro, and this is probably one of the biggest reasons why people like these for a long time, is that it gave you the freedom to hear not only what was coming out of the speaker, but also what was happening in the room. You had this speaker in front of you that would blast the sound at you. It's kind of like having your own little mini PA, but then you'd also be able to hear the room naturally through your ears, as it were. So there was no, oh, I can't hear the crowd because there's, I've got headphones in, or there's no crowd mics in my mix. So this kind of alleviates that. But at the same time, you also have a speaker now on stage in front of you that, if it starts to get too loud or cause any issues on stage, it's going to bleed into the audience. So you actually kind of have another set of speakers you have to contend with. And if you're on a small stage or a stage that's not really well treated, that sound from that speaker could end up hitting the back wall behind the musicians and then going back out. And it's kind of like a secondary PA. I heard a story one time from a friend who used to work security for this band called the Newsboys. And they told me one time that they used to run stage wedges across the entire front of the stage, and that they would run them so loud that the guy at front of house could literally turn off his main PA, and it was loud enough on stage with it bouncing off that wall and back out to the audience that it almost didn't feel like you lost anything. You could hear the mix clear as day. Now, that may sound cool for a rock show or anything like that, but for church, not necessarily, because that means that now, as the main engineer at your church, you don't have a lot of control over what's happening into your audience. You're left with, okay, well, all this sound's coming from the stage that I have zero control over because that's what the musicians want or need to hear. So how do we go about that? Well, you really can't. That's the thing, is that the wedges, that they're really great at letting you hear loud, letting you hear it with that nice openness of hearing it from a speaker in front of you that's blasting out everywhere. You can hear the room. But at the same time, there's little to no isolation, because now you're stuck with hearing whatever's coming from that speaker on stage bleeding into your room. Now, I do know that there's still churches out there that use wedges, and that's fine. Like, if that's what works for you and your team, great. You should still use them as long as you feel comfortable with it. But I really don't think that these are going to stay much longer around churches, because the adaptation of using not only in-ears for the isolation effect and giving everyone a custom mix, but also for click, because metronomes are really coming into churches everywhere now. It's so easy and so affordable to do that, to really bring your band together with a metronome and a click track, and maybe even bring in tracks like loops and such. It really isn't necessary to have stage wedges anymore, because you can't use them with those things. You can't have that click coming out of that speaker on stage, or otherwise the whole room's gonna hear it, and that's just distracting and doesn't help anybody. So what really are we trying to get at here? So monitors or stage wedges are an option. Yes. In fact, I still see them used regularly for certain events. A lot of times for big concerts and whatnot, even though musicians will be wearing in-ears, they'll still have them on stage just to have a little bit of that natural feel to them. They won't be blasting, but they'll be there just to have a little bit of that natural feel. They're also great for when you have people walking on stage for doing transition moments, or maybe even a pastor walking on a stage, or someone speaking at an engagement, being able to have that wedge in front of them just to give them a little bit of that natural sound of themselves back in their ears, because they're hearing it from this big PA hanging out in front of them and the room echoing. It can be a little jarring. So to hear your voice kind of come back to you naturally like you're expecting it to, can be really helpful. And so because they're just speaking voices, they usually don't need to be super loud, and therefore they're not going to be affecting the room as much. So what are your options when it comes to wedges? Well, there's two ways you can go about it. There are passive and active speaker wedges, which is just like any other PA system. They have ones that where you actually have a speaker with no circuitry in it. It's just got an input, and sometimes it even has a daisy chain option where you can string along several speakers together with an in and out. And then you hook that up to a power amp on side stage, and that power amp is fed via an aux input, whether it's from your front of house console or from a secondary console that's running a split mix. So that's the option when it comes to the passive. With active, however, you can do the same thing, except instead of having to have a power amp, you just have the amp built into the speaker right there in front of you. So you can do either one, but what do I recommend? Well, I'm going to tell you more about that in the next video, which is going to be all about in-ear monitoring.